The brain never stops listening, not when the light goes off, not when the eyes close, not even in the deepest hours of the night. Something keeps watch. It always has. Research published in Nature Neuroscience, drawing on direct recordings from the auditory cortex of patients undergoing monitoring for epilepsy, found that the sleeping brain shows a robust response to sound that closely mirrors its response during full wakefulness. The study, led by researcher Itzhak Fried and colleagues, found that neurons in the auditory cortex continue to fire in response to incoming sounds throughout sleep, with a pattern remarkably similar to the awake brain. The brain does not stop hearing. It stops knowing that it hears. If this is the kind of thing that keeps you company at night, please like and subscribe. The distinction between processing and consciousness turns out to be one of the most structurally important features of the sleeping mind. Even during the deepest stages of slow-wave sleep, the brainstem continues processing the fundamental acoustic properties of sound, pitch, timing, the basic frequency signature of what is arriving through the ear, while the cortical systems responsible for conscious awareness progressively disengage as sleep deepens. A study published in the Journal of Neuroscience found that this subcortical processing remains stable even in stage N3, the deepest phase of non-REM sleep, while the auditory cortex shows a graded reduction in activity as sleep depth increases. The brainstem does not know you are asleep. It is still doing its job, faithfully and without interruption in the dark. The body that has gone to sleep is not the same as the brain that has gone quiet. The reason the brain maintains this continuous acoustic monitoring is older than language, older than shelter, older than any of the things that have made the night genuinely safer than it was for most of human evolutionary history. Research on the evolutionary basis of sleep architecture has found that the maintenance of sensory responsiveness during sleep, what sleep scientists call arousal thresholds, represents a functional compromise between the deep sleep requires and the survival imperative of remaining responsive to environmental threat. A sleeping animal that lost all contact with its acoustic environment would not wake to predators, to fire, to the sound of its offspring in distress. The sentinel system is not a glitch in the sleep architecture. It is one of its oldest and most deliberately preserved features. Sleep is not the absence of vigilance. It is vigilance running at a lower voltage. This is precisely why complete silence can feel, to the listening brain, not like safety, but like an absence of signal that itself requires explanation. The auditory system has evolved to function within an ambient acoustic environment: wind, water, insects, the distant sounds of other living things, and operates against a continuous background of sound that tells it the world is there and is normal. When that background disappears entirely, the brain's threat detection systems, anchored in the amygdala and the reticular activating system, can register the absence not as peace, but as an anomaly worth monitoring. Complete silence, for a brain calibrated against a lifetime of ambient sound, can be airily louder than moderate noise, not because of what it contains, but because of what it has removed, and what the brain then generates to fill the gap. Have you ever noticed how the absence of sound at night can feel somehow more present than sound itself? The brain fills silence actively. When external acoustic input drops below a certain threshold in an unusually quiet room, in the moments between sounds at night, the auditory cortex does not simply go idle. Research on auditory perception and spontaneous neural activity has found that the brain maintains a baseline level of auditory cortex activity even in the complete absence of external sound, and that this spontaneous activity can produce the perception of internal sounds. The faint hiss many people notice in very quiet rooms, the low hum at the edge of awareness, the sense that something is present even when the environment is silent. This is not tinnitus in the clinical sense, though it is related to the same mechanisms. It is simply the auditory brain continuing to operate in the absence of material to operate on, generating its own signal because the system was not built to run on nothing. The brain in silence is not resting, it is listening harder. Tinnitus, the perception of ringing, hissing, or tonal sounds that have no external source, affects an estimated 15 to 20% of the general population and is experienced most acutely in quiet environments, particularly at night. Research at the Karolinska Institute and in multiple neuroscience laboratories has found that tinnitus arises not from a problem in the ear alone, but from the brain's response to reduced or absent auditory input from damaged hair cells in the inner ear. When the nerve cells that transmit sound signals are damaged or lost, the brain, accustomed to receiving continuous input along those pathways, responds by upregulating the sensitivity and spontaneous firing rate of the corresponding neurons. The result is internally generated activity in the auditory cortex that is experienced as sound. The brain, confronted with silence where it expected signal, manufactures the signal itself. The sound is real. The source is inside the brain that cannot tolerate not hearing. Sleep spindles, the rhythmic bursts of neural activity visible on EEG recordings during stage N2 sleep, appearing as dense waves oscillating at 12 to 14 hertz, function as one of the brain's primary mechanisms for protecting sleep continuity against external sound. Research has found that individuals who naturally generate more sleep spindles per hour of stage N2 sleep show measurably greater tolerance for noise during the night. They are less likely to show full arousal responses or measurable micro-awakenings in response to acoustic events of equivalent intensity than individuals with lower spindle density. Sleep spindles are, in a very precise functional sense, the brain's noise-canceling system, produced endogenously, calibrated to the individual's sleep architecture, and responsible for a significant portion of why some people can sleep through a thunderstorm while others wake at a closing door. The brain builds its own quiet. Some brains build more of it than others. Cake complexes, the large characteristic waveforms that appear on EEG recordings in stage N2 sleep, each consisting of a sharp negative peak followed by a slower positive wave, represents something more specific than general sleep protection. Research on their functional role has found that K complexes are often evoked by external stimuli. An unexpected sound, a brief acoustic event, and represent the brain's rapid evaluation of whether an incoming stimulus is sufficiently threatening to warrant waking. When the K-complex fires and is not followed by full arousal, the interpretation is that the brain has heard the sound, assessed it, and decided to suppress the arousal response to maintain sleep continuity in the face of the incoming signal. Each K-complex is, in a structural sense, a tiny unconscious decision. Something arrived, it was registered, and it was not worth waking for. All through the night, the sleeping brain is quietly deciding what deserves its attention and what does not. The concept of hyperarousal, a state of elevated physiological and cognitive activation that is now considered the primary neurobiological model of chronic insomnia, has a specific relationship with the acoustic environment of the bedroom. Research published in journals including Sleep Medicine and in NIH-funded studies has found that people with insomnia show elevated nocturnal cortisol levels, increased heart rate variability consistent with sympathetic nervous system dominance, and heightened sensory sensitivity during the pre-sleep period. For this population, the auditory environment at bedtime is not a peripheral consideration. It is a direct modulator of the cortisol levels that will either allow or prevent sleep onset, and complete silence, by removing the masking effect that moderate ambient sound provides and excusing every small acoustic event to undivided attention, can paradoxically maintain the hyperaroused state that it might seem like silence would resolve. For the aroused mind, silence does not muffle the noise. It amplifies what remains. Have you ever lain in a very quiet room and found yourself hearing things you would never notice during the day? Cortisol, the primary stress hormone of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, follows a carefully regulated circadian rhythm under normal conditions, reaching its lowest point in the hours around sleep onset and its highest point in the early morning around the time of natural waking. Research on the relationship between environmental noise and this cortisol rhythm has found that acoustic disturbances in the sleeping environment, even those that do not produce full awakenings and are not consciously registered, can produce measurable increases in nocturnal cortisol levels. The biological cost of noise during sleep is not limited to wakefulness. It extends to the hormonal environment the body is trying to maintain for cellular repair, immune function, and the metabolic restoration that sleep is specifically organized to provide. The body is trying to do chemistry in the dark. Noise interrupts the chemistry. The evolutionary origins of acoustic comfort preferences during sleep can be traced through the specific frequency ranges that the human brain finds consistently sedating or arousing. Low-frequency sounds, roughly below 500 Hz, are processed by the auditory system as less threatening and more associated with continuous, distant, natural sources such as rain, rivers, ocean surf, and wind through vegetation. Research in psychoacoustics has found that these frequency ranges activate the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system more reliably than higher frequency sounds, and that the consistent sedating effect of nature soundscapes on physiological markers of stress may reflect the brain's evolved association of low-frequency ambient sound with a safe and undisturbed natural environment. The frequency range of a rainstorm is, in a sense, the frequency range of safety, encoded not through learning, but through the accumulated signal of ancestral environments where rain meant shelter and stillness. The sound of rain at night is calming for a reason written into the brain before the first word was spoken. The asymmetry between how the brain processes speech and how it processes non-speech sound during sleep has significant practical implications. Research using EEG and neuroimaging has found that even during sleep, the brain allocates specific processing resources to incoming speech. The left hemisphere language networks show partial activation in response to speech sounds even in stage N2 sleep, while non-speech sounds of equivalent volume are processed in a more generalized and less alerting way. This is why sleeping with a television on, even at low volume, tends to produce more fragmented, less restorative sleep than sleeping with an equivalent level of pink noise or rainfall. The brain cannot decide to stop understanding language. It allocates attention to it automatically, unconsciously, and at a cognitive cost that the sleeping person will never directly observe, but will feel the following morning. The sleeping brain listens to words it was never asked to hear: white noise, a sound that contains all audible frequencies at equal energy levels, producing the characteristic hiss familiar from old television static or air conditioning units, works as a sleep aid primarily through the mechanism of acoustic masking. By maintaining a consistent broadband sound floor across all frequencies, white noise reduces the contrast between background silence and intermittent acoustic events. The sudden car outside, the creak of a building settling that would otherwise trigger the arousal response. Research examining white noise and sleep onset has found that in noisy environments, white noise can reduce the time to sleep onset by as much as 38% by effectively raising the acoustic floor above the level at which individual sounds register as novel or threatening. It does not eliminate the sounds. It surrounds them in something the brain has already classified as safe, so the novel event disappears into a context rather than standing alone against silence. White noise does not create quiet. It creates sameness, and the brain relaxes into sameness. Pink noise differs from white noise in a specific and sleep-relevant way. While white noise distributes energy equally across all frequencies, pink noise distributes energy in inverse proportion to frequency. Lower frequencies carry more energy than higher ones, producing a sound that is perceptually softer, warmer, and less sharp than the even hiss of white noise. Research has found that this frequency distribution more closely matches the statistical structure of many natural sounds: rainfall, ocean waves, wind, and may therefore be processed by the auditory system as more inherently familiar and less effortful to habituate to. Studies including work from Northwestern University found that targeted delivery of pink noise during slow-wave sleep deepened the restorative stages of sleep and produced measurable improvements in overnight memory consolidation, not by masking external sounds, but by directly modulating the brain's sleep architecture. Pink noise does not only cover the world outside. At the right moment and the right frequency, it speaks to the sleeping brain directly. Brown noise, also sometimes called Brownian noise or red noise, carries even more energy in its lower frequencies than pink noise, producing a deep rumbling sound frequently compared to a powerful waterfall, strong wind, or the low resonance of a large engine. While research on brown noise specifically is less extensive than on white or pink noise, the acoustic profile of brown noise aligns most closely with the infrasound adjacent frequency ranges that the body's vestibular and autonomic systems are least likely to register as threatening. Several sleep researchers have noted that the consistently reported subjective experience of calm and sleep readiness associated with brown noise may reflect the parasympathetic nervous system's particular responsiveness to deep, low-frequency sound, a response that may have roots in the acoustic experience of the prenatal environment, where low-frequency sound is the dominant sensory input. The lowest sounds the body knows may be the ones it learned before it was born. Microarousals, brief transitions toward lighter sleep or waking that last only a few seconds and are rarely, if ever, consciously experienced, can be triggered by acoustic events throughout the night without the sleeping person ever knowing they occurred. Research using full-night polysomnography has found that healthy adults experience between 10 and 30 microarousals per hour during a typical night, many of them acoustically triggered, and that the accumulation of these microarousals produces measurable reductions in the proportion of time spent in slow wave and REM sleep without producing any subjective sense of having been disturbed. The person wakes the following morning believing they slept through the night, experiencing the fatigue, cognitive impairment, and mood disruption associated with sleep fragmentation, with no way to attribute the cause. The noise that nobody consciously heard was biologically the loudest thing in the room. The sleep was interrupted by sounds too small to remember and too consistent to count. The acoustic sensitivity of the sleeping brain is not uniform across the night. Research on arousal thresholds across different sleep stages has found that the deepest phases of slow-wave sleep, which tend to dominate the first half of the night, are associated with the highest arousal thresholds, making early night sleep relatively more resilient to acoustic disturbance. As the night progresses and sleep architecture shifts toward lighter stages and longer REM periods, arousal thresholds decrease and acoustic sensitivity increases. This means that the environmental sounds most likely to fragment sleep significantly are not necessarily the loudest ones, but the ones that arrive in the second half of the night, between roughly 3 a.m. and the time of natural waking, when the brain is cycling through its lightest and most acoustically sensitive stages with the greatest frequency. The lightest sleep is not at the edges of the night. It pools in the hours before morning. The acoustic environment of the hospital represents one of the most studied and most consequential examples of sleep disruption through noise. Research published across multiple studies has found that noise levels in hospital wards from monitoring equipment, staff communication, emergency announcements, and the ambient activity of medical environments regularly exceed the World Health Organization's recommended nighttime noise limits of 30 decibels for sleeping environments, often by margins of 20 to 30 decibels or more. The sleep fragmentation this produces has been linked in research to slower recovery times, reduced immune function, elevated stress hormone levels during the recovery period, impaired cognitive performance, and greater post-hospitalization fatigue. The irony documented by sleep researchers is precise. The environment designed for healing is, acoustically, one of the worst sleeping environments most people will ever inhabit. The place built for recovery is often the place least built for sleep. Adaptation, the brain's documented ability to learn over repeated exposure which sounds belong to the normal acoustic environment and can be safely ignored, provides part of the explanation for why people who live near airports, train lines, or busy roads often report sleeping without difficulty, while visitors find the same sounds intolerable. Research on acoustic habituation during sleep has found that the auditory system can build stable neural representations of recurring, predictable sounds and progressively reduce the arousal responses they trigger through a process of conditioned inhibition. The sound is still processed, still reaches the brainstem and in some cases the cortex, but the downstream arousal machinery has learned that this particular sound does not need to be acted on. The adaptation is real and measurable. But it is also incomplete, even in habituated sleepers. The sounds that have been cognitively classified as safe continue to produce microarousals and low-level stress hormone responses, accumulating a biological cost that the sleeper never consciously registers. The brain learned to sleep through the noise. The body never stopped paying for it. Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something else, and the brain, which spent the last part of the day being told what to attend to, suddenly finds itself with nothing to follow and everything to feel. In 2013, biologist Imke Kirsty at Duke University set out to measure what different kinds of auditory input did to the hippocampus of adult mice. She compared the effects of white noise, Mozart, pup calls, and silence on neural cell growth in the hippocampal region, and found something none of the sound conditions produced. 2 hours of silence per day generated a significant and sustained increase in the number of new, fully differentiated neurons in the hippocampus. The other conditions triggered precursor cell activity, the early stage of potential growth, but only silence sustained the process through to the formation of mature new brain cells. The study, published in the journal Brain Structure and Function, was not designed to find this. Kirsty had included silence as a control condition, the baseline against which the sounds would be measured. The control turned out to be the result. The experiment set out to study sound. Silence interrupted the plan and became the finding. The hippocampus, the brain region where Kirsty's silence-induced neurogenesis occurred, is the structure most centrally involved in the formation of new memories, the consolidation of the day's learning into long-term storage, and the spatial and contextual mapping of experience. It is also one of the brain regions most sensitive to stress hormone damage. Research has found that chronically elevated cortisol produces measurable reductions in hippocampal volume over time, and that chronic sleep disruption accelerates this process. The significance of silence-induced neurogenesis in this specific structure is therefore not incidental. The brain region that silence appears to selectively support is also the brain region most implicated in the quality of sleep's memory consolidation function and most vulnerable to the corrosive effects of chronic noise and the stress responses that noise sustains. The brain grows new cells where it most needs them. Silence appears to be one of the conditions that makes that growth possible. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, is a protein sometimes described as fertilizer for the brain. It supports the survival, growth, and differentiation of neurons and plays a central role in synaptic plasticity, the mechanism through which the brain strengthens connections that have been used and prunes those that have not. Research has found that BDNF levels are elevated during slow-wave sleep and that sleep deprivation suppresses its production. One of the neurochemical pathways through which inadequate sleep impairs the learning and memory consolidation that sleep is specifically organized to support. Acoustic environments that fragment slow-wave sleep, even without producing conscious wakenings, have been found in several studies to reduce the BDNF available during the night's restorative processes. The quality of the acoustic environment is not merely a comfort variable. It is a neurochemical one. What the ear allows and determines, in part, what the brain can build. The default mode network, the constellation of brain regions that activates during rest, self-reflection, mind-wandering, and the integration of personal experience becomes more active as external demands on attention are removed. Research on the relationship between environmental quiet and default mode network engagement has consistently found that reducing external sensory input, including acoustic input, increases the depth and coherence of default mode activity. This is part of what makes genuine silence feel cognitively rich rather than empty. In the absence of externally directed attention, the brain does not go idle. It turns inward, activating the systems responsible for processing emotional experience, consolidating autobiographical memory, and running the reflective simulations through which the self makes meaning of the day. The silence that feels full is full. The default mode is doing something significant in it. The quiet room is not where the mind stops. It is where it begins to work on itself. Do you remember the last time you lay in real quiet and noticed how quickly your own thoughts filled the space? The same default mode network activity that produces reflection and memory consolidation during calm quiet also produces the intrusive thinking, the replaying of unresolved conversations, and the anxious mental rehearsal of tomorrow's demands that make pre-sleep silence difficult for so many people. Research published in journals including Sleep and Frontiers in Psychiatry has found that insomnia is strongly associated with elevated functional connectivity within the default mode network during the pre-sleep period. meaning that the brain of someone with insomnia is, at bedtime, more deeply engaged in self-referential, ruminative thinking than the brain of a healthy sleeper in the same conditions. The silence that removes external distraction does not reduce this activity. It amplifies it. By removing everything that was competing with it during the day for the mind's attention, the thoughts were always there. The silence simply stopped covering them. The thoughts did not arrive because it became quiet. They became audible because it did. The phenomenon psychologists call the rebound effect. Documented extensively in research on thought suppression, provides a partial explanation for why trying not to think in pre-sleep silence tends to produce precisely the thoughts being avoided. Research by Daniel Wegner and colleagues on ironic mental control found that the mental process of monitoring for an unwanted thought requires continuously representing that thought as the target of suppression, which means the thought must be partially activated in order to be checked for and suppressed. Under conditions of cognitive load during the day, this monitoring process can be sustained without the suppressed thought breaking through. In the low-demand environment of pre-sleep quiet, with fewer cognitive resources being consumed by external tasks, the monitoring system weakens precisely when the target thought is most persistently represented. The silence that was supposed to rest the mind gives the suppressed thoughts the opening they were waiting for. Trying not to think of something in the dark is one of the most reliable ways to think of it. Misophonia, a condition in which specific sounds trigger intense emotional and physiological responses disproportionate to the actual acoustic properties of those sounds, has a documented neural basis that research published in the Journal of Neuroscience and elsewhere has begun to map. Neuroimaging studies have found that individuals with misophonia show abnormal functional connectivity between the auditory cortex and the anterior insular cortex, a region involved in the experience of bodily states and emotional salience. When trigger sounds arrive, this pathway activates with an intensity that parallels the responses seen in threat detection and disgust-eliciting contexts. In the context of sleep and nighttime noise, misophonia is particularly significant. Sounds that most people habituate to, a partner's breathing, the tick of a clock, the low hum of a refrigerator, can, in someone with heightened auditory emotional connectivity, maintain a physiological state of irritation and arousal that is entirely incompatible with sleep onset, regardless of the absolute volume of the sound. The problem is not how loud the sound is, it is how loudly the brain has decided to hear it. The reticular thalamic nucleus, a thin sheet of inhibitory neurons that wraps around the outer surface of the thalamus, functions as the brain's primary sensory gating structure during sleep. Research on thalamocortical function during non-REM sleep, including work published in the journals Science and PNAS Nexus, has found that during sleep spindle events, the reticular thalamic nucleus actively suppresses the transmission of sensory information from the thalamus to the cortex, reducing the flow of incoming sound information to approximately 1/3 of its waking amplitude. This is the structural mechanism underlying sleep spindle's noise-canceling function. The thalamic gate closes during the spindle. The sensory signal is attenuated before it reaches the cortex, and the sleeping brain is functionally isolated from the environment for the duration of the event. The isolation is not passive. It is actively maintained by dedicated neural circuitry that closes a gate between the ear and the mind. The brain does not simply stop noticing the world during sleep. It builds a door and closes it on a schedule. The autonomic nervous system operates in two broadly opposing modes. The sympathetic branch, associated with arousal, alertness, threat response, and cardiovascular activation, and the parasympathetic branch, associated with rest, recovery, digestion, and the reduction of cardiovascular load. Research on the acoustic determinants of autonomic balance has found that the transition into parasympathetic dominance that accompanies healthy sleep onset is facilitated by a specific acoustic environment, one characterized by low frequency, continuous, slowly varying sound, and is disrupted by acoustic environments characterized by sudden changes, high-frequency content, or unpredictable variation. Complete silence sits at one extreme of this spectrum. It removes the facilitating continuous sound while simultaneously heightening sensitivity to the sudden, unpredictable events that shift the autonomic balance back towards sympathetic activation. The acoustic sweet spot for sleep onset is not silence. It is a particular quality of managed, continuous quiet. The nervous system relaxes into sound more reliably than it relaxes into nothing. Have you ever noticed that falling asleep on a train or in a car, in a moving, humming environment, can feel easier than lying still in a completely silent room? Research on pre-sleep cognitive arousal, the elevation of mental activity that many people experience in the 20 to 30 minutes before sleep onset, has found that this arousal is not simply psychological but physiological, involving elevated core body temperature, increased heart rate, elevated cortisol, and heightened sensory sensitivity that function as a package. Studies measuring electroencephalographic activity during the pre-sleep period in people with difficulty falling asleep have found elevated beta wave activity. The high-frequency brain waves associated with active, engaged cognition, persisting into the period when alpha and theta activity should be replacing it. The acoustic environment during this transition period matters considerably more than during established sleep. The pre-sleep window is when the shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance is being negotiated, and any acoustic event that reactivates the arousal system resets the negotiation from the beginning. The slide into sleep is not a fall. It is a descent that can be interrupted at any point and must start over. The hypnagogic state, the transitional zone between waking and sleep that typically lasts between 5 and 20 minutes in healthy sleepers, is acoustically distinctive in ways that research on sleep onset phenomenology has documented. During hypnagogia, the threshold at which sounds trigger full arousal drops significantly from waking levels. Sounds that were unremarkable during full consciousness can, during hypnagogia, produce vivid acoustic experiences. The hypnagogic startle, the sense of hearing one's own name, The auditory hallucinations that many people experience in the moments before sleep as brief, clear, and sometimes startling sounds. Research has found that these experiences reflect the partial disengagement of the brain's reality monitoring systems, while the auditory processing architecture remains partially active. The brain is between states and is generating auditory content from its own activity, occasionally with the phenomenological intensity of external sound. At the border of sleep, the brain begins hearing things that are not there. This is normal. It is the sound of the mind letting go. The body produces its own sounds in silence, sounds that are typically masked by environmental noise during waking but become perceptible in very quiet conditions. The heartbeat, blood flow through major vessels, the movement of the gastrointestinal system, tinnitus-adjacent spontaneous neural activity, all of these can become audible in sufficient quiet. Research on interoceptive awareness and sleep has found that heightened awareness of the body's internal sounds during the pre-sleep period can increase physiological arousal rather than reduce it, particularly in individuals with elevated health anxiety or in those who are already in a hyperaroused state. The experience of hearing one's own pulse in a quiet room or the low hum of tinnitus emerging from beneath the silence can be perceptually unsettling in ways that maintain the wakefulness it was hoped the quiet would resolve. In silence, the body becomes the loudest thing in the room. The cortisol awakening response, the sharp 20 to 30 minute spike in cortisol levels that occurs in the first hour after waking, is one of the most reliable and well-researched features of the circadian cortisol rhythm. Research has found that the amplitude of this morning cortisol spike is significantly influenced by the quality of the night's sleep and the acoustic environment in which it occurred. People whose sleep was fragmented by nighttime noise show larger and more prolonged cortisol awakening responses the following morning, reflecting the cumulative hormonal cost of a night during which the stress response system was repeatedly, if briefly, activated. The effect is not limited to nights with obviously disturbed sleep. Research has found that nights with elevated noise levels, even when no full awakenings occurred, produce measurably elevated next morning cortisol compared to acoustically quieter nights. The stress of the night's noise is paid forward into the morning's hormonal signature. The body keeps a ledger. The night's sounds appear in the morning's chemistry. Sleep-related anxiety, the anticipatory fear of not sleeping, which research has found to be one of the most reliable perpetuators of chronic insomnia, has a specific relationship with silence that clinical sleep researchers have documented. For people with established sleep-related anxiety, the bedroom environment, including its characteristic silence, becomes a conditioned cue for the anxiety response itself through the same Pavlovian conditioning mechanisms that produce any learned fear response. The silence of the bedroom at night, which was present during all the previous nights of difficult sleep, becomes associated with the physiological state of sleep-related anxiety and eventually acquires the ability to trigger elements of that state independently. The silence is not causing the anxiety. It has become entangled with it through repeated co-occurrence until the absence of sound arrives, carrying the weight of all the nights it accompanied. The quiet bedroom remembers every difficult night it held. Eventually, the quiet itself becomes part of what makes the night difficult. The relationship between the default mode network and sleep onset is not simply that rumination delays sleep. It is that healthy sleep onset requires a specific suppression of default mode activity that the acoustic environment can either support or undermine. Research published in the journal Sleep has found that successful sleep onset is associated with a measurable reduction in default mode network connectivity in the minutes before sleep, as the self-referential processing that constitutes waking inner life gradually quiets. This quieting requires the absence of new information that would reactivate the network, novel sounds, unexpected acoustic events, or voices that engage the language processing system. The transition to sleep is, in part, the story of the default mode network releasing its grip on consciousness, and it requires an acoustic environment that stops providing material for it to work on. Sleep comes when the mind runs out of things to process. The acoustic environment determines how quickly that happens. Research on the memory consolidation function of sleep has revealed that the hippocampus, which encodes new experiences during waking, undergoes a systematic offline reprocessing during sleep, in which the day's memories are transferred and integrated into the neocortex for long-term storage. This process, called systems consolidation, occurs primarily during slow-wave sleep and depends on the coordinated replay of hippocampal activity patterns. The neural sequences that represented experiences during waking are replayed at compressed timescales during sleep, allowing the cortex to gradually absorb and integrate them. Research on acoustic disruption and memory consolidation has found that noise-induced fragmentation of slow-wave sleep specifically impairs this replay process, producing measurably reduced retention of material learned the previous day, even when total sleep time is only modestly reduced. The noise that interrupts slow-wave sleep is not simply interrupting rest. It is interrupting the nightly process by which the day's experience becomes permanent. Memory is not made when something is learned. It is made while the world goes quiet enough to let the brain finish the work. The phenomenon of acoustic context reinstatement, in which sounds present during an original learning experience, when encountered during sleep in the same night, can strengthen the memory of that experience, has been documented in research from Northwestern University and elsewhere. Studies found that when specific sounds associated with particular learned tasks were played softly during slow-wave sleep on the night of learning, participants showed significantly better memory for those specific tasks the following morning compared to tasks whose associated sounds were not replayed. The sleeping brain is not simply consolidating memories passively. It is responding to cues that guide what gets consolidated and what does not. And the acoustic environment during sleep is one of the channels through which that guidance can be provided. Sound, used precisely, can speak to the sleeping brain about what is worth keeping, the sleeping mind is listening. With the right sound at the right moment, something can be said to it. The quality of silence required for optimal sleep is not absolute quiet, but rather what researchers call acoustic continuity, a sound environment in which variation is slow, predictable, and free from sudden contrasts. Research on noise metrics and sleep quality has found that it is not the average noise level of a sleeping environment, but its variability that most strongly predicts sleep disruption. Specifically, the frequency and magnitude of sudden increases in sound level against a quieter background. A steady sound floor of 40 decibels is significantly less disruptive than an environment that averages 30 decibels, but is punctuated by events reaching 50 decibels. The brain's arousal system responds to change more than to level. A continuous moderate sound is, in a specific neurological sense, quieter than intermittent silence, because silence that is broken is the loudest acoustic event the sleeping brain encounters, and it encounters it at the precise moment it has most reduced its defenses. The worst sound in the sleeping environment is not the loudest one, it is the unexpected one. Not all sound disturbs sleep. Some of it does something else entirely, something the sleeping brain has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting, since long before the first night it spent alone in the dark. Pink noise works differently from white noise in ways that matter at the level of how the sleeping brain organizes itself. White noise distributes equal energy across all audible frequencies, producing the characteristic flat hiss that masks external sounds by raising a uniform acoustic floor. Pink noise distributes its energy in inverse proportion to frequency. Lower pitches carry more power than higher ones, producing a sound that is warmer, softer at its edges, and perceptually closer to the sounds of moving water and wind through leaves. Research has found that this frequency distribution more closely matches the statistical structure of many natural acoustic environments, and that the auditory system habituates to it more readily and with less effortful processing than it habituates to white noise, which means less ongoing cognitive work is required to keep treating it as background rather than signal. Pink noise feels like something the brain already knows. White noise is something it learns to tolerate. The research conducted at Northwestern University by Phyllis Z., Giovanni Santostasi, and colleagues, published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience in 2017, moved beyond passive pink noise delivery and demonstrated something more specific and more striking. Rather than playing continuous pink noise throughout the night, the researchers developed an algorithm that detected the timing of slow-wave oscillations in real time from participants' EEG recordings and delivered brief pulses of pink noise precisely synchronized to the rising phase of each slow wave. Participants who received this synchronized stimulation showed significantly larger slow wave amplitude than those who received sham stimulation, and their performance on a word pair memory test the following morning improved by an average of 3 times the improvement seen in the sham condition. The sound was not simply accompanying deep sleep, delivered at the precise moment of the slow wave's ascent. It was amplifying the brain's own electrical architecture using acoustic input to deepen a process the brain was already running. The sound was not replacing what the brain does. It was being added to it at the exact moment the brain could use it. In a subsequent study from the same group at Northwestern, pink noise stimulation was tested in participants with mild cognitive impairment, a population whose slow-wave sleep is known to be reduced and whose overnight memory consolidation is correspondingly compromised. The researchers found that individuals who showed a 20% or greater increase in slow-wave activity in response to acoustic stimulation remembered, on average, 2 more words from the prior evening's memory test the following morning. One participant who showed a 40% increase in slow-wave activity remembered 9 additional words. The finding matters because mild cognitive impairment represents one of the earliest documented stages of age-related memory decline, and slow-wave sleep is one of the mechanisms through which that decline accelerates. A carefully delivered acoustic signal, timed to the brain's own rhythm, was able to deepen the restorative sleep stage most implicated in preserving memory, in a population where preserving it matters most. The sound was doing something the aging brain could no longer reliably do for itself. Nature sounds, recordings of rainfall, forest environments, ocean surf, rivers, bird song, produce a distinct physiological response that differs meaningfully from the response produced by either silence or synthetic noise. Research published in PMC, examining the physiological and psychological effects of forest sounds compared to urban sounds, found that forest-derived acoustic stimulation produced decreased sympathetic nervous system activity, reduced heart rate, decreased activity in the right prefrontal cortex, and significantly improved subjective ratings of comfort and relaxation compared to urban noise conditions. Functional MRI research has found that natural sound environments lower activity in the amygdala, the brain's primary fear and threat processing structure, and simultaneously activate the default mode network in the direction of restful, inward-directed processing rather than the outward, vigilant processing associated with threat detection. The brain responds to the sound of nature differently, not because of what it has learned, but because of what it has always known. The amygdala relaxes in the forest. It has been relaxing there for far longer than it has known any other kind of room. The specific quality of rain as an acoustic sleep aid has a structural explanation that goes beyond its pleasant associations. Rainfall produces a broadband, low-frequency acoustic signal with a characteristic temporal pattern, continuous but subtly variable, rich in the frequency ranges below 500 Hz, and free from the kind of abrupt onset or tonal specificity that the auditory system registers as novel or meaningful. Research in psychoacoustics has found that this combination, continuous, spectrally broad, low frequency, slowly varying, is precisely the acoustic profile that most efficiently engages the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and reduces sympathetic activation. The sound of rain is not calming because it is associated with comfort. It is calming because its acoustic structure speaks directly to a branch of the nervous system that does not know what associations are. and responds only to the signal itself. The nervous system does not hear the rain and remember feeling safe. It hears the rain and becomes safe. The womb is the first acoustic environment the human nervous system inhabits, and it is an environment defined by specific and consistent sound. Research on prenatal acoustic experience has found that from approximately the 24th week of gestation, the developing auditory system is exposed to a continuous soundscape dominated by the maternal heartbeat, a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse at approximately 60 to 80 beats per minute, overlaid with the fluid sounds of the intrauterine environment, the muffled bass of external voices, and the low-frequency resonance of maternal breathing and digestion. This is the acoustic template against which the nervous system's earliest calibration occurs. Rhythmic, low-frequency, continuous, warm. Research examining the effects of heartbeat-like rhythmic sound on neonates and infants has found strong and consistent calming effects at frequencies and rhythms that correspond to these prenatal parameters. The acoustic preferences that shape adult sleep are partly the preferences of a nervous system returning, without knowing it, to its first and longest acoustic home. The sounds that help adults sleep are often the sounds that surrounded the nervous system before it had a name for anything. Binaural beats are an auditory phenomenon that occurs when two slightly different frequencies are played separately into each ear. One frequency to the left, a different frequency to the right. The brain, attempting to integrate the two signals into a coherent auditory experience, produces a third, phantom frequency equal to the mathematical difference between the two tones. This phantom beat, which exists only in the neural processing of the two signals rather than in any external sound, can be used to guide the brain's electrical activity towards specific frequency ranges associated with different states. Research published in PMC and reviewed in the Sleep Foundation's evidence base has found that binaural beats in the theta range, roughly 4 to 8 Hz, the frequency associated with the onset of light sleep, drowsiness, and meditative states, can produce measurable increases in theta activity in EEG recordings and significantly reduce the time participants take to fall asleep. A study of primary insomniacs who used theta binaural beats for 8 weeks before sleep found significant improvements in sleep quality across all participants. The brain hears two tones and creates a third. That third tone, chosen carefully, can lead the mind towards sleep. The mechanism through which binaural beats influence brainwave patterns is called frequency following response. The documented tendency of the brain's electrical activity to gradually synchronize with a rhythmic external stimulus, moving its own dominant frequency toward the frequency of the incoming signal. This phenomenon is not unique to binaural beats. Research on rhythmic auditory stimulation has found that the brain shows entrainment responses to a range of rhythmic acoustic inputs, including drumming, chanting, and steady rhythmic low-frequency sounds. What makes binaural beats particularly relevant for sleep is that they can deliver the entrainment stimulus directly through standard headphones at frequencies that no external speaker could produce as an audible tone, because The frequencies involved at 4 to 8 Hz are below the threshold of normal hearing. The brain makes the sound it needs to follow from the 2 tones it is given. The guide towards sleep is not heard. It is constructed by the brain from what it is given to work with. The sleeping brain processes music fundamentally differently from how it processes speech, and the distinction has direct implications for the acoustic environment during sleep. Research using EEG during sleep has found that instrumental music, particularly music without lyrics, with a stable tempo, and with gradual rather than sudden dynamic changes, produces significantly fewer arousal responses during sleep than music containing voice or language. The left hemisphere language networks that maintain partial activation during sleep in response to speech sounds, generating a persistent low-level processing burden even when the content is never consciously registered, are not engaged by instrumental music in the same way. The brain does not know whether it is supposed to be understanding music. It does know it is supposed to be understanding words. Removing words from the acoustic environment of sleep removes an entire category of processing the brain would otherwise feel obligated to attempt. Music without words in a sleeping room gives the brain one less job to do all night. Lullabies appear in every culture for which musical records exist, not as a recent innovation in childcare, but as an ancient and apparently universal response to the problem of helping a young mind cross the border between wakefulness and sleep. Research in ethnomusicology and developmental psychology has found that lullabies across vastly different cultures share a consistent set of acoustic features: slow tempo, simple melodic contour, descending pitch patterns, repetitive structure, and soft dynamic level. These features are not cultural conventions any more than the preference for low-frequency sound is a cultural convention. They are acoustic structures that the infant nervous system consistently finds sedating. And research on why adults find lullabies calming, even without a child present, has found that the same acoustic features activate the same parasympathetic response in the adult auditory system. The lullaby is not a learned comfort. It is a signal in a language the nervous system has always spoken. Every culture found its own words for the same song. The nervous system was already familiar with the melody. The maternal heartbeat has a specific and documented role in the acoustic comfort preferences that persist throughout adult life. Research on neonatal response to sound has established that newborns show preferential orientation toward recordings of the human heartbeat at the resting rate of approximately 60 to 70 beats per minute, a preference that begins in utero, where the heartbeat is the most consistently present acoustic feature of the prenatal environment, and that persists as a measurable response in infants and young children. Research in adult psychoacoustics has found that rhythmic sounds in the range of 60 to 80 beats per minute produce the strongest and most consistent reductions in heart rate and cortisol in adult populations, and that the acoustic characteristics of ocean waves, which move through this frequency range at rest, are among the most reliably sleep-facilitating sounds measured in laboratory conditions. The nervous system's preference did not change. The person simply grew large enough that nobody thought to explain where the preference came from. The heartbeat the ear learned first is the rhythm the rest of the body still responds to. People who report finding silence entirely unbearable, who cannot enter a quiet room without experiencing immediate anxiety, restlessness, or the compulsive need to fill the space with sound, are not experiencing a trivial quirk. Research on noise dependence and silence intolerance has found that this response pattern, which affects a significant minority of the population, is associated with measurable differences in baseline autonomic arousal. Individuals with high silence intolerance show elevated resting heart rate, higher baseline cortisol, and greater amygdala reactivity to low stimulation environments compared to those who find silence comfortable. For this population, silence is not neutral acoustic territory. It is an understimulating environment that the nervous system, calibrated around higher levels of ambient stimulation, registers as a form of sensory deprivation rather than rest. The absence of sound is not quiet. It is the absence of what the nervous system has come to require in order to feel normal. The brain calibrated to noise does not find silence peaceful. It finds it conspicuous. The acoustic quality that most reliably produces sleep onset in laboratory conditions is not any particular sound, but a specific relationship between sound and predictability. Research on acoustic environments and sleep onset has found that the single most important variable is not volume, not frequency range, and not even whether the sound is natural or synthetic. It is whether the brain classifies the sound as background or as signal. Background sounds are those the auditory system has determined do not require evaluation. They are continuous or predictable enough that they have been cognitively assigned to the category of environmental context rather than events requiring response. Signal sounds are everything else. Sleep onset depends on the brain having nothing in the acoustic environment that it has classified as signal. The art of designing a sleep-facilitating acoustic environment is, at its core, the art of giving the brain only material it will decide to ignore. The brain does not fall asleep in quiet. It falls asleep in a sound it has decided not to hear. The three-dimensional acoustic environment of the bedroom, the way sound bounces off walls, absorbs into soft furnishings, travels through floors and ceilings, shapes the sleeping brain's experience of acoustic events in ways that research in architectural acoustics and sleep has begun to measure. Rooms with hard surfaces and parallel walls produce sound reflections and standing waves that make individual acoustic events. A footstep, a closing door, louder and more diffuse than they would be in an acoustically treated space. Research has found that sleep disruption rates are measurably higher in rooms with high reverberation times, where sounds linger and overlap, than in acoustically damped environments where sounds are absorbed more quickly. The physical structure of the space in which sleep happens is not a passive container. It is a variable in the acoustic equation that the sleeping brain is solving all night, and it changes the difficulty of the problem. The room participates in the quality of the sleep it holds. Research on the long-term relationship between chronic noise exposure and deep sleep architecture has found that populations living near major transport noise sources, airports, highways, rail lines, show systematically reduced slow-wave sleep percentages and elevated rates of difficulty initiating sleep compared to demographically matched populations in quieter environments, even after accounting for differences in subjective noise sensitivity and reported disturbance. These are not simply populations who wake up and notice the noise. EEG recordings from laboratory sleep studies with participants drawn from high noise exposure communities have found objective reductions in slow wave amplitude and duration that the participants themselves could not report because they had adapted to their acoustic environment and no longer consciously registered the sounds that were biologically continuing to cost them something every night. The adaptation is behavioral. The biological cost does not adapt with it. Infrasound, acoustic energy below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hertz, is produced by ocean waves, large weather systems, and certain natural geological and atmospheric events. Research on the physiological effects of infrasound has found that very low-frequency acoustic energy, even when not consciously perceived, can produce measurable changes in autonomic nervous system function, including alterations in heart rate variability and vague feelings of unease, or in some frequency ranges, relaxation and drowsiness. Some researchers have proposed that the consistent reports of feeling deeply relaxed near large bodies of moving water, the ocean, major waterfalls, may involve infrasonic components that accompany the audible sound and act directly on the autonomic nervous system below the level of conscious hearing. The body may be responding to something it cannot hear as clearly as to something it can. The ocean may be calming at a frequency the ear never quite registers. Something in the body does. The relationship between musical tempo and heart rate entrainment during the pre-sleep period has been studied in clinical settings with specific and consistent results. Research on music-assisted relaxation and sleep onset has found that music with a stable tempo between 60 and 80 beats per minute produces the most reliable reductions in heart rate, respiratory rate, and self-reported anxiety in the pre-sleep period, with effects appearing within approximately 20 minutes of continuous listening. The mechanism is cardiovascular entrainment. The heart's natural tendency to synchronize its rate with rhythmic external stimuli, a phenomenon documented across cultures and age groups. Music at this tempo does not simply provide a pleasant backdrop for the pre-sleep transition. It reaches directly into the autonomic nervous system and begins adjusting the physiological conditions for sleep onset before the brain has consciously decided to be ready. The heart listens to the tempo. It does not ask permission before it follows. The phenomenon of acoustic anchoring, the way a specific sound environment heard consistently during sleep over time, gradually acquires the ability to facilitate sleep onset independently of its acoustic properties, represents a form of Pavlovian conditioning in which the sound becomes a conditioned cue for the physiological state of sleep preparedness. Research on sleep onset and conditioned responses has found that people who reliably use a specific sound environment, a fan, a particular nature recording, a specific music playlist during sleep develop measurably faster sleep onset when that environment is present compared to equivalent acoustic conditions that are unfamiliar. The sound does not work only through its acoustic properties. It works through the accumulated weight of every night it accompanied the mind across the border into sleep, until crossing that border in its presence becomes something the nervous system knows how to do. The sound becomes the door. The brain, having crossed it so many times, stops hesitating at the threshold. There is a particular moment that anyone who has fallen asleep to sound will recognize. The moment when the music, the rain, the waves, the hum of the fan stops being something heard and becomes something the mind is inside. The transition is not from attention to inattention. It is from foreground to surround, the sound becoming the texture of the space rather than an object within it. Research on the phenomenology of sleep onset and auditory awareness has found that this perceptual shift, in which continuous sound transitions from being processed as an event to being processed as context, is closely correlated with the transition from alpha to theta brainwave dominance that marks the onset of stage N1 sleep. The moment when the listener stops noticing the sound is, in a neurological sense, the moment sleep has begun. The sound did not stop. The brain stopped listening to it, which means at last it had somewhere else to go. The last thing heard before sleep is the sound the brain decided it no longer needed to attend to. And then it was gone. The sleeping brain is not a single system responding uniformly to sound. It is a layered architecture, different regions, different depths, different thresholds, each doing its own work through the night, each filtering the acoustic world in its own way, according to rules built over a lifetime and a much longer history than that. Sleep spindle density, the number of sleep spindles produced per hour of stage N2 sleep, varies considerably between individuals, and that variation has measurable consequences for how well any particular person's brain filters acoustic disturbance during the night. Research characterizing sleep spindles across more than 11,000 individuals from the National Sleep Research Resource, published in Nature Communications, found that spindle properties are highly stable within individuals across different nights, almost fingerprint-like in their consistency, but vary substantially between individuals in ways that are partly genetically determined. A study estimating spindle density heritability in related subjects placed it at approximately 45%, and twin studies of the EEG frequency bands containing sleep spindle activity have estimated heritability as high as 96% in some analyses. The person who sleeps easily through traffic, through a partner's movement, through a radiator's overnight complaints, may not simply have better sleep habits or a calmer temperament. They may have inherited a nervous system that manufactures its own noise-canceling hardware in greater abundance. The ability to sleep through noise is, in significant part, written before the first night arrives. The heritability of sleep spindle activity means that the difference between the light sleeper and the deep sleeper has a biological substrate that cannot simply be trained away. Research from multiple sleep laboratories has found that individuals in the lowest quartile for spindle density show approximately 3 to 4 times the number of noise-induced cortical arousals per night compared to individuals in the highest quartile under equivalent acoustic conditions. This difference holds across different types of acoustic environments: traffic, voices, hospital sounds, and persists even after controlling for subjective noise sensitivity, anxiety levels, and other psychological variables. The high spindle sleeper is not less aware of the sounds occurring in their environment. Their thalamic gate is simply better resourced to close before the signal reaches the cortex with sufficient amplitude to trigger a waking response. The low spindle sleeper hears, in the functional sense, more of the night than they would choose to. The light sleeper is not weaker. They are operating with a thinner door. The speed and density of sleep spindle production change across the lifespan in a pattern with significant practical implications. Research on developmental spindle trajectories has found that spindle density increases during childhood and adolescence, reaches its peak in early adulthood, and then declines progressively across the adult years, with some studies finding reductions of 30 to 40% in spindle density between early adulthood and late middle age. Older adults whose declining spindle production has been well documented in the literature show correspondingly higher rates of noise-induced awakening and reduced sleep continuity compared to younger adults in equivalent acoustic environments. The difficulty sleeping through noise that many people notice as they age is not simply a psychological change in tolerance or a shift in sleep preferences. It reflects a measurable reduction in the brain's endogenous capacity for sensory filtering, a biological change in the architecture of the sleeping ear itself. The sleeping brain becomes a lighter sleeper as it grows older, not by choice, by architecture. The selectivity of the sleeping brain's response to sound is one of its most remarkable and least discussed features. Not all sounds are equivalent to the sleeping brain. It does not simply respond to volume, it responds to meaning. Research on auditory selective attention during sleep, including classic work by Oswald and colleagues and more recent neuroimaging studies, has established that the sleeping brain shows preferential processing of sounds that are personally relevant, and that among all personally relevant sounds, none produces a more reliable and robust arousal response than the sound of one's own name. A study published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience found that the subject's own name, even when spoken softly by an unfamiliar voice, elicits a strong alpha event-related desynchronization in the sleeping brain, a neural signature of the release of inhibition and the reorienting of attention that precedes arousal. The sleeping brain does not need to be awake to know it has heard its own name. The name reaches through sleep the way nothing else does. The brain has been listening for it all along. The neural mechanism underlying the sleeping brain's name recognition involves the self-relevant circuitry of the right hemisphere, the same network that, during waking, automatically captures attention toward personally meaningful information. Research using EEG recordings during sleep has found that the brain's response to one's own name, even in stage N2 sleep, includes a left lateralized theta synchronization pattern associated with the matching of incoming auditory information against long-term memory representations. The brain, even while unconscious, is running the sound against its own stored knowledge of what matters to the self. This matching process does not require waking. It happens at a level of processing that is maintained throughout sleep in a system whose primary function appears to be exactly this: to ensure that the sleeping mind, despite everything it has closed its awareness to, will never entirely miss the thing in the acoustic environment that most directly concerns it. The sleeping brain keeps one file open. The name is in it. The cocktail party effect. The well-documented ability of the waking brain to selectively attend to one conversation among many in a noisy environment has a sleep stage dependent analog. Research on auditory selective attention during different stages of sleep has found that the sleeping brain maintains a form of acoustic prioritization that differs qualitatively from what is available during wakefulness, but shares its basic functional logic. Sounds that have been classified as potentially relevant are processed with greater depth and are more likely to trigger arousal than sounds of equivalent volume that have been classified as background. A parent's sleeping brain, for example, shows significantly elevated arousal responses to infant crying compared to sounds of equivalent decibel level that are not coded as requiring parental response. A selectivity that functions independently of conscious decision-making and that operates even in deep sleep. The sleeping brain is not listening to everything. It is listening for specific things and has been the entire time. Research on pregnant women's auditory processing during sleep has produced one of the more striking demonstrations of the sleeping brain's capacity for selective acoustic attention. Studies have found that women in the third trimester show measurably different arousal thresholds for fetal movement sounds and infant-like vocalizations compared to other sounds during sleep. A recalibration that appears to develop across the later stages of pregnancy rather than being present from the start, suggesting that the sleeping brain's priority hierarchy is not fixed but adapts in response to changing life circumstances and anticipated caregiving demands. The threshold shifts occur without any conscious instruction. The sleeping brain, monitoring its acoustic environment through the night, learns over time which sounds are most likely to require a response and adjusts the sensitivity of its alert system accordingly. The sleeping brain prepares for what is coming. It does this without being asked. The process by which the sleeping brain learns to classify certain sounds as safe, reducing the arousal response they trigger over repeated exposure, is called habituation, and research on its neural mechanisms has found that it is not a simple matter of the sound becoming quieter over time. The brain does not turn down the volume on habituated sounds. It builds an active suppression response, a learned inhibition that intercepts the incoming signal and prevents it from triggering the downstream arousal architecture. Neuroimaging studies of acoustic habituation during sleep have found evidence for this active suppression in the thalamic reticular nucleus, whose inhibitory cells show increased activation in response to habituated stimuli. Evidence that the brain is not ignoring the familiar sound passively, but is actively working to contain it before it can reach cortical arousal systems. The familiar sound is heard at some level. It is then deliberately suppressed every single time by a system that has learned that this particular sound is not the thing it is waiting for. The habituated sound is not gone. It is held in check by something that recognizes it and decides, again, to let it pass. Microarousals, those brief 2 to 15 second transitions toward lighter sleep that leave no memory trace, have a cumulative cognitive cost that research has carefully measured. Studies using polysomnography and next-day cognitive testing have found that nights containing a high frequency of noise-induced microarousals, even when total sleep time and subjective sleep quality are held constant, produce measurably worse performance on tasks requiring sustained attention, working memory, and executive function the following day. Research published in Sleep Medicine has found that adding as few as 8 additional noise-induced microarousals per hour to a night of otherwise normal sleep produces next-day cognitive impairment equivalent to reducing total sleep time by approximately 90 minutes. The sleeping person is never aware that the interruptions occurred. They simply wake in the morning feeling that something was missing, without being able to name what the night took from them. The sleep felt complete. The cost arrived anyway, quietly, and without a receipt. The hospital ward is one of the most extensively studied naturally occurring examples of acoustic sleep disruption, and its findings have implications that extend beyond clinical settings. Research published in PMC's clinical review literature has found that ICU noise levels regularly reach 60 to 70 decibels during nighttime hours, comparable to the noise level of a busy restaurant or a vacuum cleaner at 15 feet, punctuated by peaks from alarms, emergency announcements, and equipment that can exceed 85 decibels. A study published in 2024 examining the effects of ward noise reduction on patients recovering from surgery found that noise reduction interventions produced significantly lower anxiety and depression scores, significantly better sleep quality ratings, shorter hospital stay duration, and higher patient satisfaction compared to standard care, and that lower neurological impairment scores on day 14 post-surgery in the noise reduction group suggested that sleep quality during recovery had consequences that extended into the depth and speed of neurological healing. A clinical review of ICU noise interventions found that sound masking approaches improved average sleep quality by over 40%. The finding that stands behind all of these numbers is the same. The body heals more completely in acoustic conditions that allow the brain to sleep more completely, and the acoustic environment of most hospitals does not provide those conditions. The place designed for healing is asking the brain to heal, while it is being continuously prevented from sleeping. The difference between sounds that wake a sleeper and sounds that produce microarousals without full waking is partly a matter of volume, but more precisely a matter of onset rate. How quickly the sound's intensity rises from background to peak. Research on acoustic arousal thresholds and sound envelope characteristics has found that sounds with rapid onset, a door slamming, a car alarm triggering, a phone ringing, produce significantly more arousal responses per decibel of peak volume than sounds with gradual onset, such as approaching traffic or a gradually building storm. The sleeping brain's threat detection system is tuned more sensitively to change than to level, which means that a sudden sound at 50 decibels can be more disruptive than a continuous sound at 60. This is why the sound that wakes the sleeper is rarely the loudest sound of the night. It is the most abrupt, the most unexpected, the one that arrived at a speed the sleeping brain had no time to classify before the arousal response was already underway. The sound that wakes is not necessarily the loudest. It is the one that arrived fastest. Acoustic environments during sleep have been found to influence the specific emotional content processed during REM sleep. The sleep stage most associated with emotional memory consolidation and the regulation of affective responses. Research has found that acoustic disturbances during REM sleep are more likely to produce arousals than equivalent disturbances during non-REM sleep, and that fragmentation of REM sleep specifically, independent of total sleep time, is associated with impaired next-day emotional regulation, reduced capacity for nuanced social judgment, and increased reactivity to mildly stressful situations. Research by Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley on REM sleep and emotional processing has characterized REM as the period during which the brain revisits emotionally significant memories and gradually strips them of their affective charge, a process sometimes described as emotional first aid. Noise that fragments REM sleep does not simply interrupt rest. It interrupts the brain's nightly attempt to make the previous day less painful. What the night's noise interrupts is not only sleep, it is the gradual softening of whatever the day was hard about. The sleeping brain's response to familiar voices differs from its response to unfamiliar ones in ways that have been measured with neuroimaging and EEG. Research has found that familiar voices, particularly the voices of close family members, romantic partners, and primary caregivers, produce larger and more differentiated cortical responses during sleep than unfamiliar voices at the same volume and speaking the same content. The sleeping brain appears to maintain not just a name recognition system, but a voice recognition system, one that attaches additional weight to the acoustic signatures of people to whom the sleeping self is most closely attached. A voice that is known is not simply a sound that is recognized. It is a sound that has been filed with an emotional relationship, and the sleeping brain processes it with the full weight of that relationship, even when the conscious mind has long since left the building. The sleeping brain knows who is speaking. It has always known. The relationship between sleep architecture and the acoustic environment extends to the proportion of time spent in each sleep stage across the night. Research on the effects of chronic moderate noise on polysomnographic sleep architecture has found that sustained noise exposure, even at levels below the threshold for conscious awakening, shifts the overall distribution of sleep stages across the night, reducing the proportion of slow-wave sleep and increasing the proportion of stage N1 and stage N2 sleep without changing total sleep time. The sleeper spends the same number of hours in bed. They emerge from a different distribution of those hours. Less time in the deep, restorative stages where neurogenesis is supported, BDNF is produced, hippocampal memory replay occurs, and the immune system performs its most intensive overnight maintenance. The sleep was present in quantity. It was missing in depth. Hours of sleep and depth of sleep are not the same thing. Noise can steal the second while leaving the first entirely intact. Research on the relationship between overnight acoustic environments and next-day immune function has found that nights with elevated noise-induced microarousal frequency are associated with measurably reduced natural killer cell activity the following day. Natural killer cells being among the immune system's primary mechanisms for identifying and destroying aberrant or infected cells. The finding connects the acoustic environment during sleep to immune surveillance function through the pathway of sleep architecture disruption. Noise reduces slow-wave sleep. Slow-wave sleep is when growth hormone release supports immune function. Reduced growth hormone output from disrupted slow-wave sleep impairs the overnight immune maintenance process. The connection is not direct. The noise does not attack the immune system. It simply removes the conditions under which the immune system does some of its most important work. What the acoustic environment does to sleep, it does to everything that sleep was doing. Among the most understudied dimensions of nighttime acoustics is the effect of very quiet but highly irregular sound environments. Bedrooms, where most of the night is genuinely silent but occasional sounds of variable and unpredictable intensity break through. Research comparing sleep quality across different acoustic profiles has found that this pattern, quiet but irregularly interrupted, produces among the worst sleep outcomes of any measured acoustic condition, including environments that maintain a moderate steady noise floor throughout the night. The brain in a genuinely quiet environment has set its arousal threshold low. The gate is more open because the signal has been confirming silence, and a sudden sound interrupts from a position of maximum sensitivity. The brain in a continuous moderate noise environment has raised its threshold and built active suppression around the acoustic floor. Silence, paradoxically, creates the conditions in which the sounds that break it are heard most acutely. The quieter the room, the louder each sound that enters it becomes. The brain's response to noise during sleep is not independent of what the previous day contained. Research on sleep homeostasis and acoustic arousal thresholds has found that the arousal threshold is influenced by accumulated sleep pressure, the drive to sleep that builds with waking time and is discharged through sleep. On nights of high sleep pressure, following a long day with insufficient prior sleep, arousal thresholds are elevated. The brain is more resistant to acoustic disturbance, because it is more deeply committed to the sleep it needs. On nights following adequate or excess sleep, arousal thresholds are lower, and the same sounds that were tolerated the previous night produce more disruption. The acoustic environment does not operate on a brain with fixed sensitivity. It operates on a brain whose sensitivity to it varies night by night, hour by hour, stage by stage, a brain that is not simply a passive recipient of whatever sound arrives, but a dynamic, changing system whose relationship to its acoustic environment is always being renegotiated. The same sound lands differently in a brain that is desperate for sleep and one that is not. The night carries the whole day inside it. Somewhere in the hours before morning, in the deepest part of the night that leaves no memory, the brain and the acoustic world around it have reached an arrangement. The sounds that were going to matter have been heard. The ones that were not have been set aside. And the mind, for a few hours at least, has stopped deciding. The prenatal acoustic environment is the first place the human nervous system ever existed. Research on fetal auditory development has established that the cochlea reaches functional maturity around 24 to 28 weeks of gestation, after which the developing brain begins accumulating acoustic experience in an environment with a very specific character. The continuous rhythm of the maternal heartbeat, the low-frequency resonance of blood flow through major vessels, the muffled bass of external voices filtered through amniotic fluid and tissue, and the soft variability of the mother's breathing. This is an environment of approximately 72 to 88 decibels of primarily low frequency, rhythmically organized sound, warmer and darker in its frequency profile than most adult acoustic environments, but continuous, consistent, and safe in a way the nervous system would spend the rest of its life partially trying to find again. Research on acoustic preferences in neonates has found that newborns show measurably preferential responses to recordings that approximate this prenatal acoustic profile, lower frequency, rhythmically organized, continuous, compared to sounds of equivalent volume that do not share these properties. The first room the nervous system knew was a room full of sound. Certain kinds of sound may feel like coming home because, in the oldest sense the body possesses, they are. The acoustic preference is older than the person. It was laid down before they had a name, the 90 seconds before sleep, the brief transitional window in which consciousness is still present, but the grip of directed attention has begun to loosen, is one of the most neurologically distinctive periods in the entire sleep-wake cycle. EEG recordings of the pre-sleep transition show a consistent sequence, a reduction in beta wave activity reflecting the quieting of active cognition, a rise in alpha waves associated with relaxed but still waking awareness, and then the first intrusions of theta activity that mark the leading edge of sleep onset. Research on the sensory experience during this transition has found that auditory sensitivity reaches a paradoxical peak in the final seconds of wakefulness. Sounds can feel briefly more vivid, more present, and more emotionally resonant than they were moments earlier, before the threshold is crossed and the ascending reticular activating system releases its hold on consciousness. The last sounds heard before sleep are often described in studies of sleep onset phenomenology as unusually clear, as though the mind, preparing to let go of the sensory world, briefly sharpens its grip before it opens. The last moment of hearing before sleep is often the clearest one. Sound is the last sense to depart at sleep onset and the first to return upon waking. Research on the sensory thresholds of the sleep-wake transition has consistently found that auditory processing outlasts visual, tactile, and olfactory processing as sleep deepens, and that auditory responsiveness returns before other sensory modalities upon awakening. This asymmetry reflects the evolutionary prioritization of acoustic monitoring in a species that spent most of its evolutionary history sleeping in environments where acoustic threat detection was the primary early warning system. The eye closes automatically. The nose does not need to monitor continuously for predators that may arrive silently, but the ear, which cannot close, which has no equivalent of the eyelid, which receives sound omnidirectionally from the entire acoustic environment simultaneously, maintains its connection to the world longer than any other sense, as though the brain, even in letting go of consciousness, keeps that one line open longest. The ear is the last thing the mind releases. It is also the first thing the mind reaches for when it returns. The specific acoustic experience of the insomniac is distinct from the acoustic experience of the normal sleeper, not only in what is heard, but in how it is processed. Research on auditory processing in people with insomnia has found elevated acoustic sensitivity during the pre-sleep period, lower arousal thresholds, heightened orienting responses to sound, and increased amplitude of auditory evoked potentials, consistent with the hyperarousal model of insomnia. What this means in practical terms is that the same acoustic environment that a normal sleeper classifies as background is experienced by someone with insomnia as foreground. The distant car, the house settling, the sound of the person in the next room, all arrive not as context but as events requiring evaluation. The acoustic environment has not changed. The system assessing it has been set to a sensitivity that makes background impossible. In the insomniac bedroom, silence is not the problem and noise is not the solution. The problem is a nervous system that has lost the capacity to decide that anything it hears can be safely ignored. The insomniac does not hear more than the normal sleeper. They dismiss less. What the recovering nervous system requires acoustically, after a period of chronic sleep disruption, high stress, or extended exposure to noisy environments, is not silence in the absolute sense, but what sleep researchers have called acoustic predictability. Research on sleep recovery following periods of disrupted sleep has found that acoustic environments with high predictability, where the sounds that occur are recognizable, continuous, and free from sudden variation, allow the thalamic gating system to rebuild its learned suppression responses more quickly than either total silence or acoustically variable environments. The nervous system in recovery is not resting from sound. It is rebuilding its relationship to sound, relearning which sounds belong to the background of safety and which belong to the foreground of response. That learning requires material to work with, and the material that serves it best is sound that behaves consistently enough to be trusted. The nervous system heals back toward sound before it heals back toward silence. Acoustic memory, the capacity of specific sounds to carry emotional and physiological associations formed in earlier life, shapes adult sleep preferences in ways that can persist for decades. Research on the long-term stability of acoustic associations has found that sounds encountered during childhood in the context of safe, relaxed, or sleep-associated environments retain their capacity to activate the physiological correlates of those states well into adulthood. The hum of a ceiling fan in a childhood bedroom, the particular quality of rain on a specific kind of roof, the low murmur of adult voices heard from another room during an afternoon nap. These sounds do not merely produce a pleasant feeling in the adult who encounters them. Research on conditioned autonomic responses has found they produce measurable reductions in heart rate and cortisol in the same range as pharmacologically induced relaxation in some individuals. The nervous system does not forget what made it feel safe at the beginning. It stores it in a place where the body can still find it. The sounds of safety in childhood become the sounds of safety for a lifetime. Individual variation in acoustic sensitivity during sleep is not simply a matter of how much noise a person can tolerate before waking. Research on acoustic sensitivity profiles and personality has found consistent associations between high sleep-related acoustic sensitivity and traits including introversion, high baseline emotional reactivity, and heightened general sensory processing sensitivity. What psychologist Elaine Aron has characterized as sensory processing sensitivity, a trait associated with deeper processing of environmental stimuli across sensory modalities. High acoustic sensitivity during sleep may therefore reflect not a deficit in the sleep system, but an expression of a more general neural architecture that processes all incoming information more thoroughly, which is adaptive in many contexts and costly in the specific context of a night that needs to be acoustically quiet enough for the depth of processing not to interfere with the depth of sleep. The sensitive sleeper is not broken. They are wired for depth, and depth has a cost at night. The acoustic environment at the moment of sleep onset functions as a kind of threshold marker, the sound context within which the mind makes its final transition from one state to another. Research on context-dependent memory and state-dependent recall has found that the acoustic environment present during sleep onset can, when reproduced during waking, partially reinstate the physiological state associated with sleep, reducing heart rate, shifting EEG towards slower frequencies, and reducing subjective feelings of alertness. This is the mechanism underlying acoustic anchoring described earlier, extended to its deepest application. The sound becomes not only a cue for sleepiness, but a cue for the specific state of release that sleep onset requires. The particular quality of letting the acoustic world pass through without attending to it, of hearing without listening, which is both the neurological definition of sleep onset and one of the most specific and personal experiences the mind possesses. The sound at the edge of sleep becomes the sound of sleep itself, silence that is experienced as genuinely restful, not as threat, not as amplifier of internal noise, not as the absence of something needed, is a specific neurological state rather than simply the absence of sound. Research on the physiological correlates of experienced silence, including work on the autonomic and cortical effects of anechoic chamber exposure, has found that the quality of silence experienced as restful is associated with parasympathetic nervous system dominance, reduced default mode network connectivity, and low amplitude, slowly varying cortical activity. This state is not produced by the absence of sound alone. It requires the absence of internally generated noise as well. The rumination, the anticipatory thinking, the vigilance, and the two absences are not equally available. External silence can be arranged. Internal silence depends on conditions that external silence can support but cannot guarantee. True quiet is not only in the room, it is in the mind that receives the room. The quality of darkness in which sound exists changes what the sleeping brain does with it. Research on multisensory integration and sleep has found that light and sound interact in their effects on sleep architecture. Light exposure during sleep increases the acoustic arousal threshold in some paradigms and decreases it in others depending on intensity and timing, reflecting the shared circadian modulation of sensory sensitivity across modalities. What this means in practice is that the acoustic environment of the bedroom cannot be fully optimized independently of the light environment. The two systems are not parallel. They share regulatory mechanisms, and the state of one influences the state of the other. A room that manages light without managing sound, or sound without managing light, is solving half of a problem that the brain experiences as one. The ear and the eye share the same night. What one experiences, the other registers. Research on the moment of sleep onset, the precise neurological transition from wakefulness to sleep, has found that it is not the discrete event it feels like from the inside. EEG recordings show that the transition is gradual, with characteristic features of wakefulness and sleep interleaved in a complex, variable pattern over a period of minutes before a clear, stable stage N1 signature emerges. During this transitional period, the brain alternates between moments of apparent sleep and apparent wakefulness at intervals of seconds, producing the subjective experience of drifting, the sense of moving towards sleep and then back, of a thought almost becoming a dream before resolving again into something recognizable. Acoustic events during this transition have an outsized effect on its duration. A sound during the drift back toward wakefulness restarts the descent. The transition is not a fall. It is a repeated approach to a threshold that the acoustic environment either keeps clear or keeps placing objects in front of. Sleep is approached many times before it is finally entered. Each approach requires a clear path. The dreaming brain responds to sound in ways that become incorporated into the dream's narrative. Research on auditory stimuli and dream content using methods including presenting specific sounds to REM sleepers and then waking them immediately to collect dream reports has found that approximately 40 to 60% of administered sounds were incorporated into the preceding dream content in some form, as environmental details, as characters speaking, as plot elements that the dream had assembled around the incoming acoustic information. The sleeping brain does not simply respond to sound as an interruption. It attempts, where possible, to absorb the sound into the ongoing experience of the dream, to integrate the external world into the internal one, rather than being pulled out of one into the other. The dreaming mind is not passive. It is, in a specific sense, creative about what it does with what the night sends it. The sound enters the dream and becomes part of it. The dreaming mind does not resist the world. It builds a story around it. The sleeping brain's internal sounds. The sounds it generates from its own activity rather than from external input include not only the spontaneous auditory activity underlying tinnitus, but the hypnagogic acoustic hallucinations, the dreamed voices and music and ambient sound that the dreaming brain produces with no external source. Research on internally generated auditory experience during sleep has found that the auditory cortex is as active during vivid auditory dream experiences as it is during actual hearing, the same neural tissue producing the same kind of signal entirely from within. The brain does not need the world to sound. It carries its own acoustic capacity, and in the depths of the night, when the outer world has finally gone still enough, it uses it, generating an entire private soundscape that nobody else will ever hear. The deepest quiet is where the brain begins making its own sounds. It was never entirely silent inside. What happens in the final moments before the deepest sleep, the transition into slow wave, when the brain is most completely sealed from the acoustic world, is a kind of compression. The self, which during waking is distributed across memory, planning, language, sensation, and relationship, narrows. The inner voice quiets. The default mode network, which has been running its self-referential cycle all evening, releases. The acoustic environment, which the brain has been monitoring, assessing, and suppressing all night, recedes from something attended to into something merely present, until even its presence stops registering. Research on cortical activity during the descent into slow-wave sleep describes this as a traveling wave of deactivation that moves across the cortex, quieting regions in sequence until the brain's electrical activity is dominated by the large, slow, synchronized oscillations of deep sleep. It is the most complete quiet the brain experiences in any 24-hour period, not the absence of input. The temporary suspension of the apparatus that turns input into experience, the self does not go anywhere. It simply stops, for a while, being assembled. There is a fact in sleep research that is easy to state and difficult to hold in full. The brain, across an average lifespan, will spend approximately 26 years asleep. 26 years in which the acoustic environment of wherever sleep was happening, the rooms, the cities, the nights, shaped the depth of the sleep, the quality of the memory consolidation, the overnight work of the immune system, the emotional repair of REM, the neurogenesis of the hippocampus, the hormonal architecture of the following morning. 26 years during which the ear, which has no lid, remained the mind's most continuous contact with the world it had technically left. 26 years of the brain listening, sorting, suppressing, attending, dreaming, in a darkness that was never entirely quiet and a silence that was never entirely still. What the ear did in all that darkness is not nothing. It was, in the most literal sense, half a life. And somewhere in all of that, in all the nights and all the sounds and all the small, unconscious decisions the sleeping brain made about what to hear and what to let go, there is one moment that research cannot fully capture, but that every nervous system knows. It is the moment when the sound that has been present all evening, the rain, the fan, the distant road, the breath of someone nearby, stops being something in the room and becomes the room itself. When the sound is no longer heard, because it has become the silence inside which everything else rests. That is not silence in the acoustic sense. There is still sound, but the brain has stopped making a distinction between the sound and the quiet, and in stopping has finally arrived somewhere it can sleep. The last thing the mind does before it goes is stop noticing the difference. If this kept you company tonight, please like and subscribe.